Have you ever felt hungry for a guy that goes beyond your stomach? A hunger that burns inside and seems to tear the soul apart in silence? In the Old West, this kind of famine was common. But what few people know is that what was eaten there was more than just food. It was a sentence, a confession, sometimes even a goodbye. Because in the saloons of the Wild West, the food wasn't just rustic. It was as raw as the life of those who walked through those creaking doors with dust on their boots and blood on their hands. And today, you're going to discover something that movies never showed: the true taste of solitude. In this video, you'll delve into a forgotten narrative. Not about gunfights, not about heroes or villains, but about what was served when night fell and men sat down, not to savor, but to survive. We'll explore what was on the plate and what was smothered behind each bite, because there was more truth in the cast iron pots than in any sheriff's promises. And when hunger sat at the table, everyone learned that eating could also be an act of desperation and of redemption. It was late afternoon when he entered. The sun streamed through the cracks of the saloon like molten gold, and the air smelled of dried sweat, wet horses, and old wood. He said nothing. No one did. There, the men talked with their eyes. He sat down near the counter, pulled out a chair, and stood still, waiting. Hunger had a name in that place, but no one dared to pronounce it. And when they finally served him the tin platter, with thick beans and a shapeless piece of meat, he just stared, as if looking into a mirror of the past. The sound of spurs hitting the cracked ground was mixed with the clinking of cutlery. There was something sacred and sad about that scene. Eating there was a silent ceremony, a pact between the living and the nearly dead. The meat, almost always tough, chewed back. But nobody complained, because in the West, complaining could be costly. Eating in silence was a sign of respect and fear. Because sometimes, what was on the plate had more history than the customer himself. An old man behind the counter was cleaning a glass with a dirty cloth. I watched everything. He knew who ate because they were hungry, and who ate because they didn't want to remember anything else. "This dish has been served to murderers, priests, and fugitives," he once muttered. And maybe it was true. The food was always the same, but the person eating it changed their face every night. The beans, cooked in fat and resignation, were not nourishing. It would silence the ghosts for a few hours, but there was one detail that no one commented on. Every dish came with a slice of hardened bread, almost like a rock, and that wasn't to save money. It was a reminder, a symbol. In the Wild West, hard bread meant that time was passing, and that not everyone could wait for the next day. Eating that bread was like gnawing on one's own mistakes. A penance chewed slowly, with one's eyes fixed on nothing, while the memory of someone dead took up residence in one's chest. One night, a man fell out of his chair while eating. No one moved. His fork was still in his hand, and his plate was almost empty. After a few seconds, one of the cowboys came over, pulled his hat over his eyes, and said, "Better let him sleep." But he wasn't sleeping. He was dead. Whether he died of hunger or guilt, no one knew. They buried him behind the saloon, no name, no cross. And the next morning, the same platter was washed and reused. Do you understand now? Eating was not just a physical act. It was a dance between the end and the beginning, between what was lost and what was pretended to be kept. And there was no menu. What I had was what was left. Bones, fat, roots, sometimes even meat from a sick animal. But everything had a purpose: to keep the man alive, or to keep him in the same place, motionless, like a shadow of himself. Eating was a break from the punishment of existence. In the darkness, only the kitchen fire illuminated what was happening. The pots hissed as if they were crying out for those who had already left. And whoever came in hungry left full, but not with food, full of silence, full of weight. Because there, every meal was like a secret shared between strangers. And maybe, just maybe, that was why no one could sleep in peace in that city. Food didn't let you forget who you were. She reminded you of her. The Wild West wasn't all gunfights, horses, and whiskey. It was also about undercooked beans, hard to identify meats, and chunks of bread that looked like rocks. And yet there was beauty, a dark beauty, like a man chewing in silence, knowing that this might be his last meal, or his last chance to pretend he still feels anything. Every saloon was a confessional, deep down, and the plate was an altar. Comment here if this woke you up. Tell me if you could chew what they swallowed every day, without losing your soul in the process. In the West, meat wasn't just tough. She was almost a provocation, a daily test of endurance. While chewing on the pieces of undercooked beef or poorly cleaned venison, many men were also chewing on their own grudges. The cut was rustic, the seasoning almost non-existent, but no one asked for more. Because asking, in that world, was a luxury, and luxury was the least of it. The dish was simple, but it carried the same weight on the shoulders of those who devoured it. It was common to find undercooked tendons, rancid fat, and tough pieces like leather, but nobody complained. Anyone who dared to complain was reminded, sometimes violently, that being alive to eat was already a privilege. There was an unwritten rule in saloons: those who chew in silence live longer. And perhaps that's why their gazes were heavy, their teeth were worn, and their hearts hardened like the meat itself served on iron plates. Behind the scenes in the kitchen, the smell was not pleasant. Meat hanging, flies dancing in the air, and a heat that would make any stomach turn before even the first fork was taken. But that didn't stop anyone. Because there, the appetite was not selective. It was urgent. Eating overcooked meat was better than not eating it at all. And even the strongest learned to lower their eyes when hunger was more pressing than pride. Survival had no taste. I had instinct. In certain more remote saloons, the cook was also the hunter, and the butcher, and the one who knew how to lie best. A dish served as beef ribs could be anything with 4 legs. There were those who were suspicious of dog meat. Others swore they tasted horse. But nobody confirmed anything, because the truth there was a luxury even more dangerous than food itself. Better to swallow quietly than die curious. Once a prospector arrived at the saloon after days lost in the desert, skinny as a skeleton, covered in dried blood and with a broken look in his eyes. They gave him a piece of almost raw meat without asking anything. He devoured it like an animal. He gnawed it with his teeth, bit it with his eyes closed. When he finished, he cried, not because of the food, but because he remembered that for 3 days he had chewed the leather of his own boots to keep from going crazy. In these lands, even the act of chewing was violent, and no one swallowed just meat. They swallowed guilt, memory, abandonment. Many men ate with their heads down, as if they were ashamed to still be alive. And each meal was a kind of deserved punishment, because the harder the flesh, the heavier the conscience. The dirty plate was a mirror, and the fork, a dagger that dug into memories as it pierced nerves and fat. The more experienced could recognize the type of man by the way he cut the meat. The impatient ones would tear it apart. The disciplined ones would slice with almost ritualistic precision. The guilty ones would push the food away without looking, as if chewing too much would open wounds. And there were those who ate too quickly, as if they were afraid someone would come and take the plate away from them. Because in the West, those who hesitated went hungry. There were nights when the noise of the jaws was louder than the out-of-tune music of the piano in the corner of the room. It was a dry, repetitive, almost animal sound. And anyone who observed closely would notice that this collective chewing ritual was also a silent scream. Each man there, devouring his portion of rough flesh, was, in fact, devouring a piece of himself, a piece that could no longer be saved. But not everyone could finish their plate. Some dropped their cutlery halfway through, got up, and went outside to vomit on the red earth outside. Others just watched the food go cold. The tough meat before them was a cruel reminder. The world was not made for those with weak stomachs. And the saloons were silent schools for those who wanted to learn how to satisfy their hunger without killing the little that was left of their humanity. Because in the end, that meat, tough, rough, often bitter, shaped more than just muscle. She shaped character, or destroy it. Every bite was a choice between giving in to hunger or bitterness. And most of the time, it was impossible to separate one from the other. The taste of Western meat would not leave his mouth. not even from memory. It remained ingrained, like dust in the bones. And even decades later, there were still those who closed their eyes and felt that taste. The taste of being alive, just barely. Not every animal that breathed in the West was spared, and not all meat was made to be served. But when despair reaches the limit of the skin, the palate no longer has an opinion. In a small village in the Dakota Mountains, they say a horse fell from exhaustion. It was the only one in the region. There had been no food for days. And what they did next, no one forgot. They opened the still warm animal, as if breaking open a sacred chest, and took out what they could. Stomach, liver, viscera. Everything was used, baked, divided, and eaten. It was as if that horse was the last sacrifice, and in a way it was. The owner cried as he helped cut the meat, not out of pity, but because he understood that after that meal, his life was over too. He was no longer a cowboy. He was a man without a horse, without direction, and with his hands covered in blood too hot to be just blood. While the animal was still smoking, they lit the fire. And that day there was no dinner. There was mourning with the smell of lard. The stomach meat was the first to disappear. They say it was soft, almost sweet, unlike anything they had ever tasted. Some men laughed out loud, trying to pretend that this was normal. Others ate in silence, swallowing a piece of themselves along with the meat. A boy threw up in the middle of the meal. He was reprimanded with a slap. "Don't waste it. This saved your life," someone said, their voice thick with guilt. And at that moment, no one was innocent. Stories about that dinner have crossed desserts. Some exaggerated, saying they saw pieces of the animal's heart being used as a base for a stew. Others said they even made sausage with the intestines. But one thing was certain, it was the most real meal many in the village had ever had, because it wasn't about food, it was about survival. And that day, everyone understood that the price of staying alive was the pleasure of devouring one's own companion. The next morning, two strangers arrived, hungry, exhausted, dirty from the road. When they heard what had happened, they fell silent. One of them sat down at the table and asked for a dish. "Anything you have." They served him the last of the horse's leftovers, and he ate slowly, as if savoring a legend. When he finished, he said only one sentence: "Now I know how to eat the end of the world." No one answered, but everyone understood, because they had already tasted the same thing. The saloon in that town was never the same again. The table where the meat was served became an altar. Nobody sat there. They didn't even put glasses or plates. It was the place where, for one night, instinct won over honor, and whoever looked at that board, darkened by time, saw something beyond the wood. I saw the exact moment when hunger became stronger than any affection, because in the West, even love for animals had a price, and he was paid with gritted teeth. This episode changed the village. Some left the next day, unable to look each other in the eye. Others stayed, but changed, more silent, harder, drier. It was as if the spirit of the horse had entered them through their mouths, and now lived within their memories. And every time someone mentioned meat, even if it was just game, silence would take over. A silence that said more than 1,000 gunshots. But still, there were those who said that dinner saved them, not only from the cold or hunger, but from illusion. The illusion that there are unbreakable limits. Because there, everyone learned that, in the face of death, even the most sacred limits can be transgressed. And perhaps that is the darkest part of all. Not what was eaten, but what was broken inside. The innocence, the purity. The idea that there are things we will never do, until we have to. In the Old West, eating was a political, emotional, and spiritual act. But at that dinner, it was a final act, a rite of passage, a milestone between what men were before and what they became after. And as the dishes were washed in silence, the water ran red and thick, as if history itself were slowly being erased. But you can't wash away what is ingrained in your soul. They left no traces, no surnames, no stories. They were dry men, with sunburned faces, hard eyes, and heavy silences. They arrived riding thin horses, with dust up to their bones and the smell of blood hidden under their leather. They sat down without asking permission. They asked for something to eat, anything. And while they waited, they lit a cigarette as if lighting a lament. They were the men without names, and their meals were as short as their lives. They had the habit of eating with their hats low over their eyes. They chewed slowly but firmly, as if every bite was an internal war. No one knew where they came from or where they were going. All they knew was that they were running from something, the law, the past, or themselves. And when they ate, it seemed like they were trying to drown it all in the shallow plate of beans and salted meat. It was like watching a farewell ritual. There was one who always ordered the same dish: beans, bacon, and a piece of stale bread, and a glass of whiskey on the side. Never changed. I never thanked him. He just ate, paid, and disappeared. Until one day, he didn't pay. He stood up, looked the cook in the eye, and said, "Today was the last time I ate like a man." He left, and hours later was found dead outside the city. The dish he had left unfinished became a legend. They said that whoever ate the rest would have the same fate. No one dared to touch. The saloon grew colder that night, as if that man had taken a piece of the place's soul, and somehow it actually did, because the nameless men did not pass. They scored. Each one left an invisible trail between the chairs and the floorboards. And even without saying a word, they told entire stories with the way they held the spoon. Some came straight from hell, prisons, battlefields, broken homes. And when they sat down to eat, it was as if they were seeking redemption. But the food, no matter how hot it was, did not melt what was already frozen inside. It was just a break, a gap between one escape and another. A frustrated attempt to rediscover a piece of humanity lost amidst bullets, betrayals, and sleepless nights. You could recognize them by their eyes. Always restless, always watching their surroundings. Eating, for them, was dangerous. It meant letting their guard down. That's why they ate quickly, or else they pretended they weren't hungry. But the hunger was there, in their bones, in their soul, in their tired expression. It was a hunger that couldn't be quenched with meat. It was something else. It was a thirst for peace, one that the plate would never satisfy. Sometimes they would leave blood-stained coins as payment. Other times they just left. And the saloon owner knew charging could cost him dearly. No one wanted to be remembered for denying the last meal of a man on the brink of death. Because in the West, everyone had a price, but few had the courage to demand it from hell. And those men were hell in human form. There was a boy who worked washing dishes. He once asked the cook, "Why do they always look sad when they eat?" The man answered without looking, "Because they're chewing what they made." That stayed with the boy. He grew up, grew old, and inherited the saloon. But until the last days of his life, he remembered the empty eyes, the heavy spoon, the silence on the fork. Maybe deep down, these men weren't coming for food. They were coming for a moment. One last chance to taste something other than guilt. And although no one said it out loud, everyone knew it. The food wasn't just a dish. It was a farewell. A goodbye that came without words, but with the taste of earth, blood, and second-rate meat. It was just an egg. A single solitary egg fried in a crooked frying pan, the oil already darkened from use. But on that sultry morning, in some saloon at the end of the world, he became an event. The request came from a different man. He cleaned his hands before touching anything. It wasn't elegant, but there was something in his eyes that gave it away. He remembered. I remembered the taste of simple things, and that's what made everyone uneasy. When he asked for the egg, silence spread, as if thunder had echoed inside each table. Nobody asked for eggs. It was expensive, difficult to maintain, and rarer than gold on a rainy day. But he didn't hesitate. He opened his bag and placed a gold nugget on the dirty counter. Nobody knew his name, but everyone remembered the sound the nugget made when it touched the wood. That sound was like a punch to the pride of those who only ate what was left over. The cook hesitated. He thought about denying it. He thought about laughing. But the man's eyes didn't ask, they commanded. It was a polite request, but one loaded with memories. He prepared the egg with the care of someone preparing a funeral. A little salt, a pinch of fat, and absolute silence all around. When he placed the plate in front of the stranger, no one dared to breathe. It was just an egg, but it seemed like a miracle. The man slowly cut the golden crust, dipped the stale bread in the egg yolk, and brought it to his mouth with his eyes closed. This wasn't just eating. It was a trip, a living reminder of what was lost. With each bite, time seemed to go back. It was as if there, at that moment, he was having dinner with his mother, or with the woman he loved, or with someone who never came back. It was impossible to know, but whoever watched felt it. And then he cried. Not much, just a shy tear that ran down his dirty face and fell on his empty plate. After that, he just got up, adjusted his hat, and left. He didn't take the change. He didn't even look back. And everyone there understood that they had witnessed something rare, not a luxury, but a man remembering what it was to be human. And that hurt, because most of the people there no longer remembered. In the days that followed, no one spoke about the egg, but the saloon was never the same again. Some began to refuse spoiled meat. Others began to chew slowly, as if they were seeking feeling where before there was only survival. The memory of that solitary gesture, of paying gold for an egg, became a symbol of something greater, a longing that no one knew how to name, but everyone carried. The cook, who had never been much of a talker, began to fry eggs every now and then, just one, without selling any. He would put them on the grill, let the smell fill the room, and then throw them away. Some said it was a tribute. Others thought he was trying to relive that moment, but maybe it was just guilt. Guilt for having served so much misery for years without questioning anything. Some customers started to disappear. They said they had gone after the Eggman. Others claimed that after eating there, something inside them changed, as if the taste had awakened forgotten memories, as if a simple meal were capable of exposing old wounds, abandoned dreams, faces that time tried to erase, and that for many was unbearable. It wasn't the egg. That's what he stood for, a reminder that there was still taste in things, even after so much forgetting, that there was still value outside the currency, that eating was also an act of remembrance, and that sometimes a simple gesture could be more powerful than a weapon, because in that West of hardened souls, the taste of dignity was rarer than food itself. In most saloons, food was just sustenance, but there were places where it became a trap for the distracted, the drunk, the talkative, or the indebted. In a nameless town, hidden among the hills and shadows, there was a saloon that offered free dinners. A sign at the entrance read, "Today, the house offers a meal. Enjoy." And those who were hungry accepted. Little did they know that they were savoring their own sentence. It was always the same dish: ground beef, black beans, and a piece of freshly baked bread. Aromatic, comforting, warm. But beneath the aroma, something was wrong, because no one here served free food. No one wasted food in the West, and those who knew the place knew. If you were invited to dinner there, it was because someone wanted you to stay up all night. The meat was too tender. The beans were seasoned with herbs that no one knew the name of. But those who ate it fell asleep, and those who slept sometimes didn't wake up. Supper was served with rare kindness, a smile, a long look, as if the cook knew that this would be the last dish of that man's life. And maybe he did, because many were served, few returned. It was a ritual, a last comfort before the end. Once a bounty hunter arrived hungry, asked for the free food. He smiled, he toasted with the others, he ate with gusto. Then he dozed off in the corner of the room. The next morning, it was gone. They said he ran away. Others who were buried behind the saloon. But the truth is that his horse was still tied up in the stable, and his pistol was still under the table. No one leaves leaving weapons behind. No one who wants to stay alive. This deadly dinner was no exception. It was a code, a message disguised as kindness, The last meal given to those who would no longer be useful, or to those who knew too much. It was better to give food than a bullet. Quieter. Cleaner. A body passed out in the back room didn't draw as much attention as a shooting in the middle of the night, and the saloon remained open, serving smiles and dishes that tasted like farewell. There were those who knew and still accepted the dish, because sometimes dying fed was better than continuing to live hungry. A man, already old, accepted the meal and ate calmly. When they were done, he looked up and said, "If it's today, let it be with the right taste in your mouth." Nobody touched him. They let him sleep. In the morning, he was still alive, and he never came back. I knew I had tempted fate, and destiny doesn't like to be challenged. The nights there were heavy. They looked darker. The laughter more forced, as if everyone knew what happened but preferred to keep up the charade. It was easier to live with the poison when it came with fresh bread and tender meat, and the scariest thing was realizing that, over time, it seemed normal. Death passed by the table like an old acquaintance, pulled up a chair, and ate together. Whoever served the food never sat down to eat. I stood behind, watching. He knew who was there by chance, and who had been marked. Sometimes I even changed the plate. He gave the poisoned food to someone no one expected, because in the West, life was a dirty game. And sometimes supper was just another move, a subtle movement, a checkmate that tastes like beans and ground beef. Perhaps the cruelest thing of all was the beauty of the scene. The table was set, the low light, the pleasant smell. Everything was perfectly set up so that the condemned man would feel, for a moment, at home. It was the last illusion, the last kindness, a supper before death. As if to say, you will leave, but you will not be hungry. And so, in silence, another name disappeared from the map. There was a saloon in Deadwood that looked more like a shadow than an establishment. The windows were constantly fogged up, the wood creaked in the wind, and the smell of burning ash mixed with something hard to name. That was where what they called widow's soup took place, a cauldron that never stopped boiling, day and night, without rest. Inside it, there was no recipe. I just fight, just leftovers, just memories. The soup was made by women who had lost their husbands to bullets, to drink, or to life itself. Widows of men who swore they would return but never did. Young widows, old widows, widows who didn't even know where the bodies were. They cooked together in silence, each adding a different ingredient. A bone, a root, a memory. This wasn't cooking. It was a ceremony of grief. Whoever ate the soup felt it. I felt the weight of each spoon, because that was not a meal for the stomach. It was for the soul. The widow's soup warmed the body and chilled the chest. Some said that when they swallowed, they would hear flashes of female voices crying softly. Others saw the faces of those who never returned. The truth is that no one left the same after eating that soup. Nobody. It was offered for free. Always. But no one would have seconds. Not for lack of hunger, but for excessive pain. The first spoonful was bearable. The second, bitter. The third was unbearable. As if the flavor carried some kind of haunting. The widows served it with an expression that mixed pity and punishment, as if to say, without words, you don't know what it's like to lose everything, but you're going to taste it. And the men ate. Eating was also a request for forgiveness. Many of them knew that they could have been the husbands of these women, or who left someone a widow in another city. The soup was a reminder that death in the West didn't just hurt the person leaving. It hurt even more for those who stayed behind. And that pain was distilled in every liter of boiling broth. It was impossible not to feel. Once a young man came in and made fun of the tradition. He said that soup was for children. He sat down, took a bowl, and laughed out loud. After the second spoonful, he fell silent. After the third, he cried. He didn't scream, he didn't run. He just cried, as if the soup had touched a part of him that had been asleep. When he finished, he got up and left without saying anything. He never came back. and his horse remained tied outside for 3 days. The widows never explained what they put in the broth. They just said it was what was left. Leftovers from other dishes, from other days, from other lives. But the taste was unmistakable. A taste of abandonment, of longing, waiting. And when the last spoonful was scraped from the bottom of the bowl, there was an emptiness so great it seemed to drag the heart along with it. Some customers asked for takeaway. "I want to give it to my wife." The widows refused. The soup couldn't leave there. It was as if she was connected to the ground, the walls, the history of the place. Taking that broth out of the saloon would be like ripping the cross out of a tomb. It was not allowed, and whoever tried was never seen in the same way again. The soup was sacred, and sacred was his pain. The stove kept burning day after day, and even when there was no one to eat, the widows cooked, as if cooking was the only way to keep the dead alive. Every bubble was a memory, every steam, a name that refused to be forgotten. And the salt, that didn't need to be added. It came from the tears that fell during the cooking, night after night, year after year. Not everything was as it seemed in the saloons of the Old West. In fact, it was almost nothing. And that applied to food too. The pots boiled not just with ingredients, but with half-told stories, false identities, and dark intentions. They served chicken that flew too low, cattle meat that no one saw being slaughtered, and a stew of the day that changed in taste depending on the customer. The dish came hot, but what he hid was always cold. The waiter served with a practiced smile, the cook with his head down, and the client hoping that, this time, it was true. But it never was. The lie was seasoning. It was protocol. It was survival instinct. Because in those saloons, telling the truth was more dangerous than serving rotten meat. The silence between the cutlery said it all. Eating was also pretending. A stranger once asked, "Is that a rabbit?" The cook replied with a dry laugh. Today he ran slowly, and everyone laughed. But no one really found it funny, because they knew that on that plate there could be anything except rabbit, maybe cat, maybe rodent, maybe something not worth naming. Because in the West, hunger made anything possible, even swallowing what would be unthinkable in normal times. But the lie was not only in the flesh. It was on bread that they said was fresh and was from the day before. In the cafe, it was just warm water with soot. It was in the fake seasonings, in the butter that was tallow, in the diluted milk. Eating was a game of make-believe. A theater set up so that the stomach would not argue with the conscience, because deep down, everyone knew what they were eating. They just preferred not to give a name, as if not naming was the same as not existing. And yet they ate, because it was easier to swallow lies than to face the truth. They were alone, broken, forgotten. Eating something real required something they no longer had, hope. So they chewed, pretended, paid, and came back the next day, like addicts to illusions. Because the saloon offered more than food, it offered escape, from reality, from hunger, and from themselves. Some of the more attentive customers tried to find out the truth. They asked questions and investigated. One of them, a former soldier, even took samples of the stew to be examined. A few days later, it turned up poisoned. They said it was bad luck. Others knew. Those who dig too deeply into the dish sometimes unearth things that should stay buried. In the West, too much truth was bad for your health. Literally. The table was an altar of comfortable lies. No one complained about the taste, even though it was bitter, because that bitterness was familiar. It was almost cozy. It was the same taste as always. Complaining was risky. Asking, dangerous. Insisting, fatal. Eating in silence was safer. Therefore, saloons prospered. Not because they offered good food, but because they offered a break from the brutality of the truth. There was an old saying in the region, "What doesn't kill you, you eat." And this phrase became philosophy. If it didn't kill you right away, it was food. And if someone got sick later, it was bad luck. This was the West. There, everything was a gamble, even the meal. Eating was like spinning the roulette wheel. The prize, Another day alive. The punishment. One less day to mourn. And the lie continued to be served, piping hot every day. In a corner of the saloon, a boy grew up watching everything. He washed dishes, cleaned tables, and listened to conversations. One day, he asked the cook, "Why do we lie so much about our food?" And the man replied, "Because the truth hurts enough. If the food was also honest, no one would come back tomorrow." And the boy understood. He grew up, and one day he became the new owner of the saloon. He continued serving the same lies, with a new smile. They said he cooked like he was writing a letter. Each dish was a silent message, a message that only those who were attentive could capture. They called him Old Irvin, a man of few words, cauldron-burned hands, and eyes that looked like they'd seen more death than any gunslinger. He worked for years in the saloon of a forgotten village, and one day he disappeared without a trace, or almost. What was left behind was a notebook, hidden between the floorboards, behind the kitchen. The notebook had no cover. The pages were yellowed, marked by grease and what looked like dried blood. Inside it there were no common recipes. They were strange notes, name lists, dates, and next to each name, a description of a dish. But that wasn't the scariest part. It was the standard. Every time someone disappeared from the village, a new dish would appear on the saloon menu, and the name of the missing person was recorded on those pages. No one knows who found the notebook first. But when word got out, the saloon became a cursed place. Some swore that Old Irvin cooked for the dead, others who used human flesh. There were pages of scribbles that looked like formulas, temperature notes, and something like rituals. One passage read, "When the soul is ready, the taste will be unforgettable." And below, the name of a young man who was never seen again. The authorities did not investigate. They were afraid. Because Old Irvin was respected, feared. He knew too much. I knew when someone was going to die. I knew who deserved a special dish. And perhaps most disturbingly, no one ever got sick from his food. On the contrary, many said they had never tasted anything so good, as if somehow he knew exactly what each hungry soul needed to eat before the end. A former customer, haunted by his daughter's disappearance, came to the saloon years later. He ordered a dish that Old Irvin used to make, beef in a thick gravy with roasted potatoes and sweet onions. When he tasted it, he cried. He said he could feel her presence, that the taste took him back to a time in her childhood, something only he and she knew. And after that, he never went back. Neither did he, nor did the dish. The notebook was hidden. Some say it was burned. Others which are buried under the stove itself, along with Old Irvin's secrets. But the saloon remains there, remade, silent, with new dishes, and a new chef who never speaks. The old residents whisper. He reads the notebook. And sometimes, when they bite into a piece of meat, they feel something strange. A memory that is not theirs. An emotion they can't explain. And even with time, no one dares to ask what is behind the new soup of the day, or the new stew that appeared on the menu without explanation. Because deep down, everyone understood the lesson. There are things you shouldn't know. There are flavors that hold stories. And there are dishes that, instead of nourishing, imprison. As if whoever tasted them became part of something bigger. Something invisible. Something eternal. They say that whoever reads the notebook can smell the cauldron, even with their eyes closed. And he hears low voices, as if the pages were whispering. Names, requests, unfulfilled wishes, as if each recipe were also a calling, an evocation, an invitation to taste the darker side of memory. And once you hear it, you can never forget it. Not everyone ate to satisfy their hunger. Sometimes the dish was just an excuse, a hiding place, an excuse to not have to think, because chewing is a noise that distracts, that occupies the mind, that silences the screams that come from within. In the Wild West, where everything was dust, loss, and survival, there were those who ate just to keep from going crazy. They sat in front of the food as if facing a tomb. No appetite, hopeless, only with the automatic gesture of someone who wants to delete something. The fork moved on its own. The eyes were fixed on nowhere. The plate was an empty landscape and the taste irrelevant. Some men chewed tears, others chewed memories. The act of eating became a ritual, pushing the past into the stomach, hoping it would stay there. But the past cannot be digested. It ferments, it rises, it comes back. And sometimes it explodes in the middle of the meal, with a spoon thrown against the wall or a cry hidden behind a hat. Others ate for another reason, not to forget, but to remember. Because taste was the last connection with someone. A wife who made that dish, a mother who baked bread on Sunday, a brother who loved well-done meat. To eat was to revive. It was to reconnect. It was feeling something that life had already brutally ripped away. And for a few seconds, the man became a boy again, and the food, a bridge between two worlds. There was a soldier who always asked for baked sweet potatoes. No one understood. It was a rare thing. He paid a lot and sometimes waited days for a shipment. But when he received it, he ate it with his eyes closed. After a long time, he confessed, "My sister used to do the same. She died burning potatoes on the stove." That potato was a belated farewell, a hug that never happened, a request for forgiveness served in silence on a wooden plate. In the West, taste had memory. Each flavor could be a knife or a hug. A simple dish could bring back the pain of a loss, or the joy of a memory thought to be buried. Eating was not an isolated act. It was affection. It was trauma. It was identity. And the more difficult a man's life was, the more ritualistic the meal was. Because there, in those spoons, he found fragments of himself. There were people who just ordered the same dish every day, not out of habit, but out of fear. Fear of trying something new and being invaded by memories I couldn't bear. Others, however, tried everything, like someone who is searching, like someone who hopes, with each bite, to rediscover the taste of a life they no longer live. And so they went on, some running away from the taste, others running after it. And when the plate was empty, the silence was thicker than before. It was as if the food opened holes instead of filling them. As if each meal was not an end, but a beginning of something deeper. Many left the table worse off than when they arrived, because by trying to silence what they felt with food, they ended up digging themselves even deeper. In the Wild West, nobody talked about feelings, but all the feelings were on the plate. They were in the way the man cut the bread, at the speed at which he drank the thin coffee, in the decision of whether or not to leave that last piece of meat. That was where confession lived. The soul spoke to the cutlery, and the mouth silenced what the heart screamed. Not every death in the Wild West came with a gunshot. Some came silently, lukewarmly, served on deep plates and wooden spoons. In many saloons, cooking was an act of survival. In others, it was a form of revenge. And so it was that food took on another role, not only to sustain, but to decide destinies. Betrayed wives, outlaws sworn to death, impatient debt collectors, all of them, at some point, had a single idea: to kill with flavor. The poisons were discreet. Some were made from common herbs. Others were made from substances brought by foreign caravans, difficult to detect, impossible to taste later. The most common was belladonna, colorless, tasteless, deadly. A simple extra seasoning in the evening soup, and no one knew what they were eating. The waiter smiled. The cook lowered his eyes, and the customer ate slowly, unaware that that bite would be his last. One night, a woman came in through the back door of the hall. He was carrying a basket. Inside, a cake. I said to the cook, "It's for my husband. He'll know it was me." The man did not question. He served the cake. The husband ate. He smiled. He said it was the best he had ever tasted. 20 minutes later, he fell down with his eyes bulging and foaming at the mouth. The woman walked away in silence. No rush. No one stopped her. She was freer than ever. Death by plate was clean, no trace, without fuss. And it was perfect for the Wild West, where no one had the time or the courage to investigate. When a man died eating, it was said that it was fate, or that it was bad luck. But the truth is, there was often love there. Painful, distorted, vengeful love. Or hatred disguised as kindness. Because whoever wants to kill without getting their hands dirty, cooks. Some saloon owners used poison as a way to settle debts. A customer who owed too much, who drank and didn't pay, got a free dinner. A treat from the house. The next day, he no longer appeared, and the debt book became lighter. It was a silent system, a balance between justice and cruelty, and nobody complained. Because in the West, anyone who complained ended up on the next menu. There was a chef who was famous for never repeating a recipe. They said he customized each dish according to the customer's history. Once a drunk man assaulted a girl in the saloon. The next night, he was served a stew that smelled too sweet. He ate it, he praised it, he slept on the counter, and he never woke up again. No one moved it until dawn, and the plate, after being washed, was used normally, as if nothing had happened. Those who paid close attention knew that the most beautiful food was the most dangerous. Colorful dishes, well served, overly arranged, were suspicious. Those who lived in the West knew that nothing was so generous without a reason, and so many began to refuse kindnesses. "I don't accept free food," they would say, because they knew the price could come later, and not always in coins. Even the smell of the food could give it away. Some substances altered the aroma of the broth, but those who were hungry didn't notice. The belly spoke louder than instinct, and death, which was hidden in the spoon, was silent as night. It was only realized when it was too late. When the body began to feel heavy, the eyes became dull, and the heat of the soup turned into chills. Poisoned cuisine was an art, a dance between justice and barbarity. And perhaps that's why no one spoke about it out loud. It was a collective pact of silence, because everyone knew someone who had died that way. But no one wanted to admit it, because admitting it would mean acknowledging that, at some point, we too could be the next dish served. It was late at night when he arrived. The moon was high but weak. The few stars barely managed to pierce the darkness that covered the city like an ancient mourning. The saloon was empty, except for the owner and a dog sleeping under the stairs. The man entered silently. He wore a heavy overcoat covered in dust and a scarf that hid half of his face. No one knew him. No one heard him speak. He just pointed to a table in the corner and waited. The cook hesitantly prepared something simple: rice, beans, meat, a common dish. But the night would not be. He ate slowly. He chewed as if he were counting the seconds. The fork never made a sound on the plate, and his eyes, those eyes that no one could look at for long, were fixed on nothing. After the last bite, he wiped his mouth, took a notebook from his pocket, and wrote something. He left the note under the plate, got up, and left. The dog barked restlessly. The saloon owner walked over to the table and read it. On paper, just one sentence: "The West swallows more than it digests." And below, nothing. No signature, no signal. Just a stain that looked like ink or dried blood. The saloon owner ran to the door, but the man was already gone. No footprint, no sound. As if it had evaporated into the cold dawn air. And it was there that the doubt arose. Who was that man? What did he come for? Or, what did you come to leave? The next morning, the plate was still there, cold, intact, but different. The meat looked darker, the rice too moist, and the beans had a smell that no one could identify. They called the priest, they called the blacksmith. Nobody played, no one dared to move. It was as if that plate held something, a presence, a curse, a memory. And so he remained, covered with a white cloth, for 7 days. On the 8th, they decided to bury him. Not the man, he remained a mystery, but the dish. They dug behind the saloon, in a forgotten corner, and there they deposited what was left, like someone burying a body, like someone sealing a curse. And over the hole they placed a simple wooden plaque, with the same phrase as the note: "The West swallows more than it digests." And no one ever talked about it again. But what came next was worse. The food in the saloon began to spoil quickly. The stove fire went out by itself, and for a few nights the puppy would bark at the corner of the kitchen as if he saw someone there. Some said it was just paranoia, others that the man had left more than one message. Maybe a warning, or maybe he never existed. Maybe it was just a reflection of everything that City tried to hide. They say that ever since that night, travelers who order the same dish, rice, beans, and meat, have had strange dreams. They dream of endless deserts, of tables full of empty plates, of voices whispering words that no one understands. Some wake up sweating, others don't wake up. And when someone asks, the saloon responds with silence, because the name of the dish was never recorded, and the man's face was never remembered. The truth is that the Wild West is hungry. Hungry for poorly told stories, for forgotten people, for souls that passed too quickly to be understood. And sometimes this hunger serves itself, on ordinary plates with cold cutlery, just waiting for someone, anyone, to sit at the table and accept to eat what should not be served. Not all food nourishes. In the Old West, eating was often a mechanical act, but one fraught with unseen consequences. Each bite carried with it a weight that went beyond the meat and beans. It was the weight of the day that had passed, of what had been lost, of what had been done to remain sitting there, alive. The food might have been small, but the guilt, it came in generous portions. And chewing was often bearable, like someone holding back tears in the corner of their mouth. There was a man who stopped in the middle of the meal. The fork was shaking. Sweat dripped even in the cold. It wasn't hunger. It was a memory. It was the stomach refusing to swallow what the mind could no longer hide. A piece of meat could bring back the smell of a house that had burned down. A sip of broth, the voice of a son who never returned. Because food, in the West, wasn't just for the body. It also served as a means of memory and penance. Some ate everything. They scraped the plate clean as if hunger were eternal. But it wasn't just hunger. It was fear of running out, of reliving the time when there was nothing left to chew. They ate quick, desperate bites, as if time was against them. And it was. Because in the West, you never knew if the next dish would come, or if you would still be alive to taste it. Eating was like racing against your own death, one forkful at a time. Others left food on their plates, always the same piece, the last one. What could complete satiety? But they didn't complete it, as if that last piece symbolized something they couldn't accept, that they were somehow satisfied. And in the West, satisfaction was a sin. It was time to let our guard down. It was assuming that you can stop fighting, and nobody there wanted to stop, because stopping was dying slowly. Once, a wanderer ordered a dish and just stared at it. He didn't touch it. He didn't speak. When the owner asked why, he replied, "I've eaten too much in my life, and nothing has filled me up." That echoed for weeks, because everyone understood. It wasn't about the stomach. It was about the emptiness that not even the best feast could fill. An emptiness that came from within, where neither food, nor alcohol, nor sleep could reach. And yet, everyone came back, day after day, for the same plate, the same fork, the same chair, as if condemned to the same eternal ritual. Eat, wipe your mouth, pay, and come out with the same weight, or even more. Because eating there was like confession, and no one was forgiven. The dish was not redeeming, the plate accused. It was a shallow, warm mirror of what the man carried inside. The ancients said that the taste of food changed according to the state of the soul. A bitter bean on a guilty day, a dry bread on a day of mourning, a tender meat when something good, even if rare, happened. And many knew this, but pretended not to notice, because recognizing the taste was admitting what one felt. And in the West, feelings killed more than guns. Even the sound of chewing said something. Some ate as if they were chewing anger, others as if they were swallowed from within. They had those who chewed guiltily, slowly, as if each bite was an apology. And there were those who chewed with pleasure, the most dangerous, because there were few of them. And almost always, The pleasure came from remembering what they took from someone. Each dish was a judgment, a verdict served without a jury, without a defense. And when it was finished, the sentence was carried in silence. People left the table with a full stomach and an even emptier soul. Because in those days, feeding the body was simple, but sustaining the soul was too expensive, and no one there had the change for it. Every night, when the saloon closed its doors and the last glasses were washed, there was a final ritual, silent, somber, almost sacred. The leftovers were not saved. They were not reused. They were burned, carefully thrown into the fire, as if saying goodbye to something that no longer belonged to this world. Some said it was for hygiene. Others knew there was something more to it, because they didn't burn leftovers. They burned memories. The stove outside, fueled by pieces of bread, meat left on the plate, gnawed bones, took on a life of its own, and the rising smoke carried more than the smell of grease. It carried stories. It carried decisions. It carried perhaps the last traces of someone who had dined there for the last time. Because in the Wild West, where death was common and remembrance was dangerous, covering one's tracks was a matter of survival. And the fire was the mute confessor. They said that on certain nights, the smell of the ashes was different, too strong, almost human, as if what was burning was not just food, but something more, something that could not be buried. The cook, old and hunched, threw away the remains with a tired, almost sad look. No one knew why, but he knew what each dish had witnessed, and he knew that some meals needed to be forgotten, urgently. One day, a new boy in the village tried to hide a piece of meat to eat later. He was found crying behind the kitchen with the burnt meat in his hands. The cook grabbed him by the shoulders and said, "Here, leftover food is dangerous. It reminds me." The boy never tried to save anything again, and he learned, like everyone else there, that fire was not the enemy. It was healing. It was forgetfulness. It was the only way to avoid being followed by what was left on the plate. There was a story about a man who refused to burn his last meal. He kept a bone as a souvenir, a simple gesture. But in the days that followed, he began to hear voices while eating. I could taste the same meat in everything I tried. I didn't sleep. He didn't speak. Until one day, it disappeared. They say he threw the bone into the fire and it disappeared along with the smoke. Maybe I'm gone. Maybe it was taken. The saloon fire burned steadily, and even without new wood, it never seemed to go out, as if it was fueled by something deeper, something that didn't come from the wood, but from pain, from regret, from longing. And every night, when the flames danced alone in the darkness, the villagers knew this was the bonfire of last suppers, where what could not be said was burned in silence. The travelers found it strange. They asked why there were no scraps, no leftovers, no garbage. The saloon owner responded with just one sentence: "Here, even memory is dangerous," and went back inside. Because there, everyone knew that the real weight was not in what you ate, but in what you left on your plate. And the fire took care of that. It reduced to dust, the ash, what no one else could touch. On some early mornings, the flames seemed to take shape. Faces, silhouettes, as if the souls of those who had not returned home were dancing one last time in the heat of the embers. And those who got too close said they heard laughter, or crying, or both mixed together. But no one confirmed it, because there was fear. Fear that what had been burned would return. In that village, fire was more feared than the revolver, because fire did not kill, fire exposed. And there were truths that could not be seen, that needed to turn to ashes. The plate, the glass, the dirty napkin. Everything disappeared before the sun rose. And what did not disappear burned along with the regret. As the years passed, the saloons disappeared. The voices disappeared. The pianos went out of tune into silence. Dust covered the tables. The bottles turned into ghosts, and the kitchens were silent. And with them, the flavors also disappeared. The taste of salty meat, of bread burnt on the edges, of thin coffee that seemed more like water of sadness. Everything was being erased by the rush of modernity. But what was lost was not just cuisine. What was lost was a part of the soul of a time when even the act of eating was brutally honest. Today, no one can exactly describe the taste of the food served in the Wild West. Maybe because it was never about the taste. It was about the moment, about who was next to you, about what had been left behind before sitting at the table. Food, at that time, was a memory disguised as a meal. It was a farewell disguised as lunch. It was love hidden inside a tablespoon of nerves and fat. The revenues were not recorded. Nobody cared, because the stories that inhabited each dish were too difficult to repeat. It was like trying to write a man's pain on a stained sheet of paper. Food was made with whatever was available, and what was available was not always noble. But even so, there was something sacred in every pot, something you can't replicate with ingredients, only with experience. And when someone tries to recreate those dishes today, something is missing. It's not the salt, not even the point of the meat. It's silence. The look of someone broken in front of the plate, the presence of death peering through the door, the urgency of a world that didn't wait for you to finish your meal before taking everything away. It was this backdrop that seasoned the food, and that was what gave meaning to the flavor. There was, deep down, a raw beauty in all of this, a silent dignity, a survival ritual that transformed any piece of bone into an altar. And that is why, when people talk about Wild West food today, few understand it. They think it was just dried meat and beans, but it was more. It was all that man had when he had nothing left. It was the last anchor before the abyss. Each dish was a farewell in disguise. Each bite, an attempt to say, I'm still human. And maybe that's why so many people today feel empty even when their stomach is full, because what's missing isn't in the food. It's in what she represented, in times when people chewed more than meat. Existence itself was being chewed up. Saloons turned into ruins. The dishes rusted, fires went out. But the stories, they continue. They live in the echoes, in the smells that appear out of nowhere, in the collective memory that insists on remembering what time tried to erase. Because the taste of truth, even when it is hard and bitter, does not disappear. He hides, and it comes back when you least expect it. Perhaps the taste of Western food will never return, but what she provoked can still be felt in the silence of a night, in the weight of a full plate, in the memory that appears with any smell. Because there are things that time tries to erase, but the soul insists on keeping, even if it hurts, even if it weighs. If this made sense to you, comment, I'm here in the comments. Tell me, what flavor of your life do you still carry, even when you try to forget?